Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are across the globe. Welcome to Guerilla Lean. Boy, do we have a good webinar for you in store today. It is my honor to introduce Dan Markovitz in just a few minutes, who's going to give you a quick overview of his new book that's out called A Factory of One. And it's a book that, even though I thought I was quite organized and efficient, even I learned a ton of information, and I've incorporated quite a bit of it into how I'm now practicing. So I look forward to this webinar. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who may be new to the GoToWebinar technology, you should have both a viewer window and a control panel showing. If your control panel is not showing, there's a double arrow icon you can click to get it to appear, and if you want to hide it and get it out of the way on your screen, you can click it and it will disappear. If you would like to listen through speakers and you want to ask questions, you will need to use a microphone to ask those questions, and everyone is currently muted, so you can make all the racket you want to in the background and we won't hear you. If you're using a telephone, please enter pound and then the audio pin that appears on your control panel followed by pound, so that you'll be able to hear, and we also can communicate if you'd like to ask a question verbally. And speaking of questions, if you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways to do that. One is through raising your hand. There's a little hand symbol there, and I can take questions verbally. But again, if you're listening through speakers, you will have to have a microphone in order for us to be able to hear you verbally. Or you can type your question into the question log. And because now there'll be both me behind the scenes here and Dan presenting, we may actually take questions throughout the session. So please feel very free to ask questions throughout the session. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dan Markovitz. He will give you a little more of his background, but I met Dan about a year and a half ago or so and have been quite impressed with his background, both in terms of his business school and business management and business performance angle, as well as his personal performance and personal enhancement, personal productivity side to how he's incorporated Lean into his management philosophy. He teaches at both Ohio State and in Stanford, and he's also a faculty member at the Lean Enterprise Institute. His new book, A Factory of One, is out now and available, I believe, in an ebook version as well as printed book versions. And he's pretty active on Twitter, has a lot of good posts, as well as a blog on his website that I recommend you sign up for either through RSS feed or email triggers. He has very provocative ideas, and I learn a lot every time I read one of his blog posts. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn over the presentation to Dan and make him the presenter, and then he'll share with you Guerilla Lean. Just 1 second. There we go. Dan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Karen. I will apologize to everyone in the event that that my voice cracks in the middle. It's actually not puberty. I'm coming off of a cold, and sometimes my voice breaks in the middle. So I do apologize if something is inaudible or sounds a little bit funny. It's currently about 2:05 here on the East Coast, which is where I am. I have no intention of talking for an hour because no one, not even my mom, wants to listen to me for that long. So what I'd like to do is present some of the ideas in, I don't know, maybe a half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that, and leave plenty of time for questions and answers if you have any, and if not, well, you've won the temporal lottery and you get to go home and you go back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Dan, do you mind if I remind them of one thing as well?
Yes, please, please.
Toward the end of Dan's presentation, we're going to do an actual activity. So if you have a stopwatch available, either on your cell phone or on your watch or whatever, I'd recommend you get that ready. And also, will you need paper, pencil, or pen for that activity as well? So please get those ready if you'd like to participate in that. It'll be, again, toward the end of Dan's presentation. All right, go ahead, Dan. Thanks.
Darn it, I knew I forgot something. What you see here on your screen is an ASICS Gel DS trainer. I worked at ASICS for about 4.5 years, quite a few years ago, and this was one of my proudest accomplishments. Well, almost. This shoe was actually the genesis of my interest in Lean. It had nothing to do with the manufacturing of it. I was in product marketing and product development, and We worked very, very hard on this shoe. We had some interesting new technologies that the R&D group had put together, and we had a new lacing system we were working on, and we had to work really hard to make sure those came to fruition. We also did some interesting things with the outsole. So we worked really hard on making sure these new features worked properly, and we were all very pleased with it. We had our final samples made, we had our sales samples made, we put the shoe to bed, and one day my boss, who forgot more about footwear than I will ever know, says to me, "Dan, this is a pretty nice shoe." And I said, "Well, yeah, Gary, thank you very much." He said, "Do you notice anything odd about it?" And I said, "Well, you know, we've got some different construction features. I'm really proud of that. We worked hard on getting it." And he said, "Do you see anything else?" And now I'm starting to get nervous. And I said, "Well, no, actually, it looks pretty good to me." He said, "Take a look at the tongue." And I said, "Oh, yeah, right, of course. You know, the tongue looks different. It sure does, because we have a different kind of stitching on the tongue. It's unusual. We've never done something like that." He said, "No, that's not what I'm talking about." He said, "Take a look at how long the tongue is." And I'm looking at it, and I said, "Oh, boy." Turns out that we left the tongue about 10 millimeters too short. We were so intent on working with this new technologies and incorporating them properly that we totally whiffed on checking to make sure that the length of the tongue was right. And if the tongue is too short, it doesn't ride up on your shin the way it should. Instead, it pokes into your instep, and it's really uncomfortable. And we couldn't put out a shoe like that, so we had to make a small change, and it only cost us about $7,000 to change the fabric cutting dies at the factory. $7,000 mistake that could have been avoided, and that's when I started thinking, I bet there's a better way. I'm going to come back to this shoe a little bit later. The title of this talk and the title of my book is A Factory of One, and I want to explain the metaphor. My feeling is that whether you're Toyota producing cars and you get a whole bunch of rubber and steel and glass on one end of the factory, and if out the other end comes a Camry, or whether you are Pratt & Whitney and you get a bunch of tungsten steel and high-tech electronics, and out the other end comes jet engines, or whether you're making toaster ovens, or whether you are in your position and you're making marketing plans or advertising campaigns, or you're making budgets for the year. You are a factory just as much as Toyota is, just as much as Pratt & Whitney is, just as much as someone who makes Hostess is. You get these raw inputs, and out comes whatever it is that you do. Out comes your outputs, and that makes you a factory. And because you're a factory, I believe fundamentally that we can improve the process by which you work and make it more efficient. So we think about it, and you take things like information, and you take customer requests, and you add in some ideas of your own, and you mix in some pizza and some beer, or if your company doesn't allow that, we'll do something like soda, and we'll do Red Bull, and you work really hard, and out comes something really brilliant. An iPhone, a campaign, a budget, a legal brief, whatever it happens to be. How do we make that process better? Well, I think we can use lean tools to make it better. The first thing I want to say now is that it's very, very important, and the reason this is Guerilla Lean is that it's important to ignore the culture. A lot of people, when they consider lean, they say, you know what, we tried it, but we can't do it. The corporate culture isn't aligned. It's not going to fly. We just can't do it. And I believe you can ignore the culture, because if you think like the Guerilla, you can create your own culture. You can create your own pocket of excellence. You can work differently, irrespective of what the culture is, irrespective of how supportive the culture is or isn't. And that's really important, because if we start like this with a small step and we ignore the obvious problems where the CEO or the division vice president doesn't get this lean stuff, you can make a change. And eventually, as you start working better, people are going to notice. And if you can get a colleague to work a little bit better because he or she is following your lead, now more people are going to notice, and pretty soon they're going to say, hey, what's going on over there? Why are these guys working better? Why is there less confusion? Why is there less rework? Why is there less waste? Why do things come out of them faster? You don't need permission. One of the really wonderful things about thinking like a Guerilla is that you don't need managerial or vice president approval. After all, what you're doing is making a change in the way you work, and you don't need permission for that. Whether you apply concepts of 5S or concepts like flow, you can do all of these things to yourself and for yourself. You don't need budget, you don't need approvals, you are free to act. And that, I think, is incredibly empowering and enables you to make a big change without having to struggle against the bureaucratic inertia of your organization. The first step, there goes my voice, the first step, I believe, in thinking like a Guerilla and applying Guerilla Lean is asking classic Lean questions, like what's the value and where's the waste, or what's the waste? And what I mean by that is really taking a look at what you do. What is the value in your work? And that means that you have to go to the Gemba, which is kind of an odd concept because every single day, of course, you work in the Gemba, you work in your office. But what I'm saying is that you go in and you really observe what you do. It's legend. I don't know if it's a legend or if it's real. You can never really tell with Yogi Berra. But he's reported to have said that you can see a lot just by looking. And I think that it's essential to really take a look at what you're doing. Because what you'll find, I think what you'll be shocked to find, is how little value you're creating and how much waste there is. To spot the value and to identify the waste, I think it's important to take a look at what you're doing through the prism of what the customer wants. This is a pretty classic Lean idea, of course. But if you take a look at what you're doing and what your customer wants, and then you ignore instead the outputs, the deliverables, or even the process, you can start to see things in an entirely new way. So for example, if you were working, many of you I'm sure are working in organizations that have the dreaded performance review. All right, I'm not going to get into my whole philosophy. I won't climb up on a soapbox about whether performance reviews are good or bad. But if you think about the purpose of a performance review, fundamentally what you're trying to do, let me rephrase that, fundamentally what your customer wants, which is to say your direct report, what your customer wants is some guidance on what's been going right and what's not been going, and areas for improvement, and some idea of how to progress within the organization. That's really what it's about. However, if you take a look at what your performance reviews are like, and hopefully you guys are groaning or rolling your eyes or just sort of giggling about this, you think about it, and it is filled with enormous amounts of waste. It's page after page after page of boilerplate things that you have to fill in that may or may not be relevant, and ends up obfuscating, confusing, and often hiding whatever it is that's really at what your customer, which again is in this case your subordinate, what he or she really wants. What am I doing right? How can I do better? And what is my path forward? And if that's all you gave them, they would probably be really, really happy. But of course, you have to play this whole performance evaluation game. Now, I'm not suggesting right now that you change it, but that's the kind of distinction between value and waste that I'm talking about. Have you ever spent time working on the obligatory 52-slide PowerPoint deck that you're going to present at a management conference or an executive conference? It's taken you hours. Have you stopped to consider, and for that matter, have they considered whether they really need all 52 or 152 slides? There's a possibility that a one-page or a half-a-page summary in bullet points might be sufficient. But because the culture rewards 152-slide PowerPoint slide deck, that's what we end up doing, and it's an enormous amount of waste. So that's the kind of objectivity that I would like you to think about having in your mind when you look at your own, when you go to the Gemba and look at your own work. So let's talk about 3 tools that are essential to lean that I believe you can apply for yourself. And the first is 5S. And to start this, I'd like to do a little experiment because you've been listening to me for about 10 minutes now, so it's time for you to do something. There's going to be a poll. I'm going to show you a slide for 5 seconds. What I'd like you to do is write down how many circles you see. Very simple. 5 seconds, how many circles do you see? Get your pencils ready. Oh, and by the way, please, there's going to be a poll after this, and you're going to vote on it. So how many circles do you see? And go. And stop. So Karen, I believe, is collecting the poll. And
yes, the poll's up right now.
Did you guys see 18? Great. So your choice, of course, are 18, 24, 27, or 32. And it looks as though I'm unable to see the answers. So Karen, I'm going to rely upon you.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. So you can tell me what people will come up with.
So we'll give 2 more seconds for people to vote. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And can we see the results? No. All right.
Well, I tell you what. Keep in your mind what you came up with.
Dan, I'm sorry. Dan, here it is. I'm sorry. It went away and then it came back. So we have the highest is 43% with 27, 35% with 32, 21% with 24, and 1% with 18.
All right. Excellent. I'd like to do that one more time. The same sort of poll. Or we don't have to do a poll, but I'm going to show you another slide. Same exercise, 5 seconds. How many circles and how many colors do you see? And here we go. Now, I'm hoping, the reason I'm not doing a poll is that I'm hoping that most of you got 27, although given that we've got No Child Left Behind and all kinds of problems with our school system, there's a possibility you didn't. If you didn't, don't tell anyone. But, you know, it's always 3 times 3 times 3. I'm thinking, please, God, let them get 27. The information that I just showed you is the same. It's exactly the same, 27 to the 43% of you that got it right. Congratulations. The information is absolutely the same. It was just organized differently. And that, to me, is what 5S is about. This is a picture of Oscar winner Al Gore. This is not him in the White House. This is post-White House. This is not what you would call a 5S compliant office. Not even close. He may have the cure for solution for global warming there, but he would never know it because he can't find it in there. And at this point, you're probably thinking, oh God, this jerk is probably going to tell me I have to clean up and organize my desk and come by with a white glove. And not at all, because this is not 5S either. This is just purely stupid. This is not lean. This is what my friend and colleague Mark Graven would call lame, lean as misguidedly executed. This is pointless. No one that I know of has ever lost their phone or their computer or their scissors, for that matter, on their desk. Well, maybe scissors, but usually not very much. So these taped outlines are stupid, and yet that's what people think of when they think about 5S. What I would argue is that this is not what you want, because the purpose of 5S for you is to make your information easier to find, not your phone, not your scissors, not your computer. No one loses their computer. There are a group of nurses at the Covenant Health System in Texas. They embarked on a 5S project that really summarizes and hits what I'm talking about. They looked at the nurses and how they spent their shifts, and they found that in a 12-hour shift, the nurses were spending 6.1 hours. That's more than 50%. 6.1 hours doing paperwork. And no one that I know who's a nurse got into the nursing profession so that they could spend more than half their time doing paperwork. So they took a look at all of their forms, and there were a lot of them because they generate 3.2 million pieces of paper a year. Imagine that, 3.2 million forms a year. And they said, hey, wait a minute, some of these forms are duplicative. And not only that, These forms are hard to use because sometimes my name goes in the top, sometimes at the bottom, and sometimes the doctor's prescription goes here on the left and sometimes here at the top right. And things were all over the place, and it took people forever to figure things out. So they brought 5S to the information, and they standardized the placement of the information in the forms. They reduced the amount of time they spent doing paperwork by 50%. They cut it down to about 3 hours, and they reduced the amount of paper, the number of pages generated by 48%. Still a lot of papers, but they really were able to focus their time on creating something of value, which is taking care of patients. About 3 years ago, Chevron embarked on something like $250,000 IT upgrade. They found internally, in their own internal research, that people were spending between 1.5 and 3 days per month looking for information. In 1997, the Wall Street Journal did a study of about 2,500 senior executives and found that they were spending about 6 weeks a year looking for information. It's mind-boggling how much time we spend looking for data and information and not actually doing anything with it. The last story I just want to tell you about is a guy I know who used to work at a large investment bank who, for reasons, and you'll find out in a minute, I won't identify, he was promoted to vice president. He was an up-and-comer, and he was a bit messy. So one day his boss, one of the managing directors, came up to him and was saying, hey, now that you're vice president, how are things going? And he said, you know, things are going pretty well. She said, just not for nothing, but you're in the high potential employee program. Your desk is kind of a mess. And while you're doing a good job, just so you know, if you look around at the managing director's desks, they're actually pretty clean. They're pretty organized. This just doesn't look all that good. And he said, yeah, I know, but I'm really busy. And as they were talking, she noticed this crumpled piece of paper on the corner of his desk, and she pulled it out just because she was poking around, and it was a check. It was a refund check from the IRS. It was a refund check from the IRS for $14 million. Now, when we're dealing with $14 trillion deficits, I suppose $14 million doesn't sound like a lot. But back in 2007, before the market melted down, $14 million was a lot of money, and frankly, to me, it still is. Hell, even the interest on $14 million is a lot. So here was a guy who couldn't find the necessary information, which for him was how to the refund checks that he needed to forward and process and so on. So that's all I'm going to say right now about 5S. We can talk more about it later if you have questions. The next idea I want to bring up is the tool of visual management. You hear about visual management or visual controls in a manufacturing setting all the time. And the reason it's important, I think, in particular for you, is that if you work in an office, your knowledge and the processes in which you're involved are invisible. And to the extent that we can make them visible so that you can observe what's happening, it's going to give you a greater ability to know what it is you're supposed to do. And more importantly, for someone like you who has 20, 30, 40, 50 things that you could be doing at any given time, I think visual management is a way to help you select among all those competing priorities to determine what it is you're supposed to do. And before I go into what those tools might look like, I want to tell you about a woman named Sheena Iyengar. Sheena is the author of a book called The Art of Choosing. She's a professor at Columbia Business School. She got her PhD at Stanford, and a few years ago when she was doing her dissertation, this is what she did. She went to a supermarket on a little north of Stanford, Drager's, if anyone's from that area, high-end supermarket, and she set up a table with a little tablecloth on it, and she put on a white coat, and she laid out 6 samples of jam. She took one jam company, she laid out 6 samples of jam, and as people came in, she gave them taste of the jam. Hey, do you want to try this blueberry, try this blackberry, try the boysenberry, whatever. And as you might expect, jam sales, as they tracked to the store, increased, which kind of makes sense because this is why you see these people in the store, because when you have a sample of a sausage or some chicken or whatever, macaroni and cheese or jam, you tend to buy more of it. So Sheena redid the experiment, but this time, instead of using 6 of the jams, Sheena put out all 24 varieties of jam in that company's product line. Now you would think if you get more choices, it's going to be a little bit better, right? Because you may not like blackberry, boysenberry, alala berry, or gooseberry, but you might like apricot or orange or strawberry or lemon or something like that. It turns out that that's not what happened. Jam sales not only went down, they went down by 400%. And Sheena was thinking hard about this because she thought, this is crazy. We're increasing the likelihood that someone's going to find a jam they like and buy some. What's happening? And this is what she came up with. This is my very, very fancy graph. She decided that choice is paralyzing, that your ability to choose and act is inversely related to the number of choices you have. And after about 6 or 7 choices, you just get overwhelmed. And if any of you have chosen options in your 401k, do you want large cap international or small cap domestic? Do you want to buy into the S&P 500 or the Russell 1000? Do you want high growth or do you want stable investment? It's overwhelming and you just go, I don't really know what to do. If you bought a cell phone, a smartphone recently, same experience. How many gigs of data do you want to have? How many cell phone messages, text messages you're likely to send? How many minutes do you want? How many people do you want in your friends and family circle? It's just brutal. You can't make a decision. And so what happens is, as I see it, when you walk in and your work is not visible, you have this feeling of, oh my gosh, I've got to do this and this and this and this and this. And you got swirling in your head the 75 tasks you have to do. And with those infinite choices, or the numerous choices anyway, you kind of freeze. Well, which I don't know, which should I do? What should I do first? And that leads you to one of 3 courses of action. Either you dither impotently, you do a little bit here, and then you go to the next thing, and you do a little there and a little over there, and there's no accomplishment at all. Or you default to the very simplest thing so that you can take care of it 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes and feel good about getting something of anything done. Or what most often happens is you take a look at your to-do list if you have one, or you just think about all the things you have to do and you say, okay, well, I could do A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way to R, or tell you what, let me just check email for a sec, and then I'll get back to what, then I'll really do something. But of course, by the time you're done checking email for a sec and responding and reading and responding and reading, 45 minutes or an hour goes by, and you haven't done anything. All you've done is waste time. So what we want to do is reduce the number of choices. What we want to do is engage in what psychologists call self-binding. Like Odysseus, if you remember Odysseus and the Sirens, Odysseus wanted to hear the song of the Sirens, but he didn't want to drive his ship into the rocks. So he ended up tying himself, or having his sailors tie him to the mast, so he could listen to it, but the course of action that the ship took was fixed. He couldn't change course. So what we want to do is start engaging in a certain amount of self-binding, predetermining what you're going to do. And I want to suggest 2 ways of doing it. One way is by using the calendar. It's very, very simple. Most people only put appointments in their calendar. They don't actually put their own work in the calendar. And what I want to advocate is that you want to pre-decide what you're going to do and you put in your own work. So on Monday, May 26th, in the screenshot, there's the hour preparation for the quarterly performance review. From 2:30 to 3:30, there's the grant writing proposal. On Tuesday in the afternoon, I continue working on the grant. And I complete the performance evaluation for Sarah, and so on. What I'm advocating is that you allocate all of your work to the calendar. Now, what's going to happen is that it's going to be overwhelming. If you try putting everything in there, you're going to find that you've got 30 hours worth of work in a 24-hour day, which obviously is impossible. But my belief is that if you're going to get run over by a truck, you might as well get the license plate. You might as well see all the work that's coming at you. Because unless you can do that, you can't reduce the cognitive burden that comes from looking at this unending to-do list, or even worse, the infinite email inbox, if that's what you're using to really drive your work. What you want to do is allow this, the pre-decision that goes on here, to help you figure out what it is you're going to do. I've been talking for a little bit, so it's always good to take a Dilbert break. So I'll give you a sec to read this. A lot of people think about Outlook as a tool for email, and it really isn't. It's a tool, it's a work management tool. And I would argue that the most important aspect of Outlook actually is not the inbox at all, it's the calendar. So I'm advocating that you're using the calendar to drive your work. And if you think about any old movie that was set before the advent of, made before, or set in an era before the advent of calendars, and if you think about any movie that had a scene in an office, I always think of Jimmy Stewart going into Mr. Potter's office in It's a Wonderful Life. And you think about those old desks, that big mahogany or oak desk, and on one side you've got that brass lamp with the green shade, and on the other side you got a telephone, and right smack in the middle of that desk is a blotter. And on that blotter was a month-at-a-glance calendar. Because it was really important, if you're leading a business, is to see where you are and where you're going, and to choose what it is that's important. You can't do that if you're looking at your inbox all the time. So there's a possibility you're going to be allergic to calendars. For some people, it just doesn't work. They can't manage calendars for any one of 1,000 legitimate reasons. So I want to suggest another idea, and this really comes from a guy named Jim Benson, who's the author of a book called Personal Kanban, and he's really been, it's been an eye-opener for me as I read through his work. The idea being that you can manage the flow of your work and move to kind of a pull-based system by creating a Kanban for yourself. So what does a Kanban look like? This is a traditional whiteboard that a friend of mine used to use. He's at Westinghouse, I think, or was there. He created a task board, and you'll notice there's a list of all the tasks. What do you need for it? When's it due? What the status is? And he said this just didn't work at all. And he ended up moving to, again, this idea of a personal Kanban, where he created a backlog of tasks. He limited the work in process, his doing column, to 2 to 3 things at most, and then he had a pile of a column for all the things that were done, so that he had some sense of context, what needs to be done, what I'm supposed to be working on, and what I have accomplished. This enabled him to manage his work and know where he was going, so he didn't get mired down in the task of the moment. It also allowed him, in this case, to color code the yellow tasks, the yellow Post-it notes were for one category of work, and the pink ones were for a second category. Here's a guy that created a personal Kanban out of using PDCA as the model. So he could see the plan, which is the backlog, the do, which is the work in process, the check, of course, is something that is the next phase, but he always knew where he stood. This is actually from Jim Benson. This is a really interesting Kanban because on the top, you see sort of the micro view. These are the individual tasks in the backlog. Here's the ones that I'm doing. Here's the ones that I've completed. And the section on the bottom shows the entire value stream. This was for the book he was writing, showing the backlog, showing the stuff that's in pre-writing, the things that he had to focus on, the edits, the second edits, the final, and so on. So at any given time, you could see both where he was at the micro level and where his work stood in the overall value stream of the book. This is from a couple of guys, a group that work in a biomedical device manufacturer, and you can see you've got 4 people's Kanbans in a way. You've got the backlog for Jim and for whoever NFW is, and for Kevin and for Joe. They are color-coded in a way. You can see the backlog. There's the stuff they're waiting on other people to do. You can see the working on area and so on. The pop-up must-do are the periodic emergencies that come up, the I'm on fire, put me out kind of things. And then, of course, the done column. So there's an infinite variety of Kanbans you can create, but the point is that instead of having an infinite to-do list, no context, or instead of leaving all the things that he had to do swirling in his head, instead made it visible so that he had a sense of what he's supposed to be working on, what needs to be done, and what was accomplished. The last tool that I want to talk about is flow. Now, flow in a factory setting has a very clear, you have a clear idea of what it means, parts moving steadily down a production line with no buildup of inventory. There is a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He is a Polish guy who is now a professor at Claremont University, and he has written a book called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Performance. And that is the kind of flow I'm talking about. Psychological flow, flow for you. How can we take advantage of the notion of flow, because again, you're a factory, and make it so that, and exploit it so that you become smoother, more productive, and more efficient. And in order to show you a little bit about the power of flow, we're going to have an experiment. And this is where I'd like you to pull out your pens and your paper and your stopwatches. So I'll give you a sec to get that organized. And this is what we're going to do. The first thing you're going to do is draw two parallel lines about, I don't know, 3-4 inches wide, maybe an inch or two apart on the paper. And I'm going to give you a sentence. And what you're going to do is copy the sentence and on the top line, and on the bottom line you're going to write down a number, so that each time you write a letter, you write down a number on the bottom line. And you're going to time yourself on this exercise. So it would look like this. The sentence will be multitasking is a lie. You're going to write M and then 1, U 2, L 3, T 4, I 5. So alternating letters and numbers like this. And there's no secret formula. It's just the sequence that you're doing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way to the end. So you have multitasking is the lie at the top, 1 to 19 at the bottom, or 18 I think it is actually, I apologize. And you're just going to write letter number, letter number, letter number. And I want to because oftentimes there's one or two people in any group that get it wrong, please don't write multitasking is a lie and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Write M1, U2, T3, L3, T4, and so on. So what I'd like you to do is start doing this. I'm going to say ready, set, go. You're going to do it. You're going to time yourself. And then in the questions area, what I'd like you to do is submit the time it took you to do. Just, whether 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 51 seconds, whatever it happens to be. So ready, set, go.
I feel like I should be singing the Jeopardy theme in the background.
Right.
Do, 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 do.
Karen is available for parties, by the way.
I'm waiting to see the times coming into the questions area. I see some of the people on the line already who would have done this in Phoenix yesterday, or day before yesterday live. It was quite fun. All right, they're starting to come in. 28, 35, these are seconds. 28, 35, 30, 32, 31.2, ooh, precision. 33.3, 44.9, 45, 43, 28, 39, 35, 28, 32, 38.63. 25, 35, 33, 41, 43, 33. So let me look. The low is 28. Wow, that's fast. And the high so far looks to be 46.9. So we'll say 47. Oh, wait, here's a 55.
Makes sense that we're getting a couple more people at the end.
Yeah. Okay, great. That gives us a good spread.
So, Karen, the fastest was about 28, and we went up to
55.
Most people were around 38. It sounded like 37, 35, and then 51 at the high side.
Right. There were a couple of 40s, yeah, but I'd say 38. If I was, going to just quickly do a median in my head, it's probably about 38.
Okay, that jives with pretty much what I've seen when I do this, and I've done this hundreds of times. So I want to do this again, one more time. So draw two more lines, just like I have here, and this time you're going to time yourself again, and this time you're going to do it in the way that is intuitively a lot more sensible. So what you're going to do is write multitasking is a lie all at one time, and then when you're done writing that, you're going to do all your numbers, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 18 or 19. That's 18.
18, right.
So I'm going to give you a ready, set, go, and one more time you're going to time yourself, and then in the question area, I'd like you to submit your time so that everyone gets a sense of where what the difference is. So ready, set, and go.
Okay, they're coming in. 16, 17, 15, 16, 17, 15, 14, 20, 15, 22, 17, 19, 15, 16, 18, 19, 21, 20, 16, 17, 20, 19, 18, 25, 19. So it looks like they're clustering around 18 and 19.
So approximately 100% faster, 50% difference.
Right.
It's taking about half the time. So intuitively, that sort of makes sense, right? The reason I bring this up is that what I'm asking you to do essentially we don't really multitask. We switch tasks. We don't do two tasks at the same time unless it's something simple like walking and chewing gum or driving and talking on the phone, I suppose. What we really do is switch tasks. We do task A and then B, then we go back to A, and then we go back to B. What's significant to note is that even in this very, very simple simulation where you're doing relatively cognitively simple tasks, writing a number and writing a letter, it cost you 50%. It doubled the time it took you to do this, and this is something really simple. Now, if you think about the way you work at work, you spend most of your life, most of your day multitasking. You're sitting there working on a document, and then someone knocks on your door, and you talk a little bit, then you go back to the document, and then ding, there goes your email, and then someone calls you, and then you go back to work. And what happens is your day is nothing but a series of interruptions, nothing but a series of switch tasks. And as a result, it takes you, what, 30%, 40%, 50% longer to get your work done. The data is absolutely incontrovertible on this. There are academic studies from the University of Michigan, from Vanderbilt University, from UC Irvine, from Stanford, among other institutions. And they all show that this notion of multitasking and the cognitive cost of switching from back and forth is really, really significant. My favorite bit of data for you comes from the University of Michigan, actually, where they found that people are on average interrupted every 11 minutes. That it takes on average 25 minutes to get back to the task that they started. And my favorite part is that 40% of the time they don't get back at all because they forget about it, because we're animals and we get distracted by shiny objects. And if you've ever closed down your computer at the end of the day and found a couple of emails that you started writing and you have no idea why you were writing them and what the point was, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what we want to do, oh, and by the way, this is not, although I'm talking about flow and I talked about Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, this information really is nothing new. This is something that Peter Drucker said back in the Effective Executive in 1967, that to be effective, you've got to dispose of time in large chunks. If you have small dribs and drabs of time, like 3 minutes or 11 minutes or 6 minutes, it's not going to be sufficient even if you stay at the office till 8 o'clock at night. You're just killing yourself. So you've got to figure out a way to start reducing the interruptions and improve the flow of your work. Incidentally, there is some early research. It has not been published yet because it's not final, but there is some indication that the act of trying to multitask and the act of dealing with all this task switching really does make your brain a whole lot smaller. And so it has a severe long-term neurobiological effect. But seriously, what you might want to think about is how you can reduce some interruptions, and some ideas are batching your email, doing it twice a day or 3 or 4 times a day, but not as each message comes in. You might want to try closing the door and putting a sign up that says, my door will open again at 2:30 or 11 o'clock or whatever time. You might want to try leaving the office and going to a conference room or going to a Starbucks. But to the extent that you can carve out uninterrupted time, you're going to be a whole lot better off. And that's how the concept of flow for materials applies to flow for your brain. I promised that I would get back to the story of my shoe, and so I want to talk about standard work. The idea of standard work, of course, is that we have the best way that we know right now to do a particular job. If you take a look at the way there's an awful lot of variability in the things you do, and a lot of that variability really is unnecessary. Atul Gawande, who is a physician and a writer for The New Yorker, wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto. And years before he wrote the book, my experience with that GLDS trainer taught me about the power of checklists. They're incredibly valuable in helping you standardize the way you work. So in order to make sure that we never, ever again forgot about the length of the tongue on a shoe, we created a prototype review sheet. So every shoe that came in, as we made samples, we would look at the shoelace length and the number of eyelets and the tongue length, of course, and the toe reinforcement coverage and the ankle collar height and so on and so forth. And this is something that worked for us. You can do, and that was for reviewing a shoe. This made sure that we did it in the same sequence, the same way every single time, and we didn't miss anything. Atul Gawande, in one of his articles in The New Yorker, talks about a private equity firm that has a checklist for their acquisitions to make sure that they don't forget before they make a $10 million investment in a technology firm, to make sure to find out whether the engineers are willing to move from Silicon Valley to Iowa, because that has real influence on whether they make the investment. This is one type of standard work. There are other ways we can create standard work, which I'd be happy to talk about later on. But the point is that even your work, even though you consider yourself a creative knowledge worker, and you are, there are pieces of your work that we can systematize and standardize. And if you don't believe me, I want to introduce you, at least by picture, to a friend of mine named Mark Javen. Mark is an emergency room doctor down in Florida. There is nothing more unpredictable and chaotic than an emergency room. And yet Mark figured out a way to make standard work apply. He used to get overwhelmed by the patients coming into the ED, and not only that, Mark figured out that that a lot of times the emergency room was getting clogged with patients with relatively minor problems. You know, someone sprained a finger, someone cut their arm, and they just needed a Band-Aid or a couple of sutures. And Mark saw this terrible flow and saw people waiting. So in an emergency room, they triage patients on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is someone's about to die and everything stops. As you can imagine, there are not too many of those. 5 is someone needs a Band-Aid for a cut on their finger. And then there's 2, 3, and 4. So 2s are people that require some significant help. 4s are much less help, and 3s are, we're not really sure, are they a 2 or a 4? And Mark found that the charts of incoming patients were just piling up. So he said, hey, wait a minute, I can bring standard work to this. So he created a standard work where he said, all right, I'm going to grab 3 charts at a time. I'm going to grab a 2, a 3 and 4, and a 5, assuming that you have those. What he would do then is go to the person who is 4, a level 4, and he would go to them, check them out, and order a test. Then he would go to the level 5 person, take a look at him, discharge him. Then he would go to the level 2 person, and they were more complicated, and so he would order various tests to do. Then he would go to the level 3. If he didn't have a 2, he'd go to a 3, and he'd have to assess them, figure out what was going on. By the time he was done with them, he'd go back to the person who was level 2, and he'd review the tests because the initial tests were done. And then he would cycle back to the person who was 4 or 3, take a look at them because their tests were done. Then he would grab another batch of 3 charts. So rather than letting the level 5s, the kids with a sprained finger, stay there for hours and hours and hours until all the more urgent cases were done, he had a way of moving them through quickly, and he had a way of organizing it so that while he was looking at one person, the other person's tests were being done. And not only did this create faster throughput, less lead time to process the patients, it reduced the stress on Mark enormously so that he always felt in control. Even when a big slug of patients would come in, he knew what to do, in what sequence, in what order. He didn't have to figure out who should I see first. So if Mark can bring standardized work to an emergency room, I would challenge you to figure out how you can bring standardized work to your office. The last thing I want to say is that if you're trying to have lean in your organization, you can only lead by example if you live by example. lead it, live it. Show people by your own actions what it does. Show people the benefits. And now it's your turn. Questions, comments, issues, whatever's on your mind.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and switch back over to my slide now, and we're going to open it up to the Q&A section. So hang on one second. Let's see, show my screen. Thank you very much, Dan. That was very helpful, and I'm sure that everyone got some very good suggestions they can incorporate. I actually have done a personal Kanban board now for about 2 months. It started when I was being overwhelmed by book-related tasks, and I started one, and I find it tremendously helpful. The only thing that I'm having still a problem with is that it's not in a visually accessible place, and so I'm going to be physically moving it to a different wall in my office so that I see it more. It's kind of almost behind me right now, and I need to get it right in front of me. So it's I highly recommend it. So we're going to go ahead and take some questions. Now I notice that there are 2 hands up. I'm going to put those hands down because I think they may have been put up by mistake. But Jody and Paul, if you want to ask a question verbally, if you'll please re-raise your hand, then I'll know that you really did mean to ask a question verbally. And we're going to go ahead and start taking questions. Dan, why don't you go ahead and make sure you're unmuted as well. Are you there, Dan? So Dan, I need you to
Karen, you have to unmute me. Yep,
there you go.
Now I'm unmuted.
There
it's
you
under
go.
your control, actually.
All right, excellent, thank you. All right, so here are a couple questions that have come in. Andrew's asked, can you restate the name, please, of the doctor in the emergency room?
His name is Mark Jabin, J like John, A, B like boy, E, N like Nancy. And his story actually appears in more detail in my book, Factory of One. Great,
thank you. Okay, Robert has a question. I like the passage about scheduling your work in Outlook. I have also advocated building repeating tasks that are critical to the lean management system in leader standard work. Any experience in this regard or tips?
Well, I think that, first of all, kudos to you for doing that. I think that's exactly what needs to be done because oftentimes people forget that these initiatives do comprise small steps that need to be repeated all the time. To the extent that you can make those things visible, I think is really useful. And what I mean by that is, an example is really at Group Health up in Seattle. They've really done some wonderful work with leader standard work. And they actually have physical cards, I mean, literally cards about, oh, I don't know, 5 by 7, something like that. Maybe they're 5 by 5, I can't quite remember. But the cards have questions written down on them, and the leaders take the cards over to the Gemba, they ask those questions, and then when they're done having their Gemba walk, they go back to their area where those cards are, and they flip the card over to indicate that that is done, that the standard work is done. So rather than having it just being in the calendar, there's a physical artifact that indicates what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to ask, when they're supposed to do it, and indicates that in fact it's been done successfully. But kudos to you for doing that. That's wonderful.
Great, thank you. Mark has a question. Can we get the names of the books that Dan mentioned? And then there's a related one where Karen has asked, who's the author of the Choice is Paralyzing study? Could you repeat those?
So the first one, the choice is it's called The Art of Choosing. It's by a woman named Sheena. Sheena is like Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Sheena. Her last name is Iyengar. That's Iyengar. Sheena Iyengar. Obviously, if you go to Amazon, you can find this. The book on flow that I talked about, The Psychology of Optimal Performance, is by a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It's not spelled anything like that at all, and it would take about 10 minutes for me to spell it for you on the webinar. So what I would say is if you just Google flow, The Psychology of Optimal Performance, you will find it.
I'm actually going to bring it up right now on my screen.
Oh, thank you so much, because again, it's impossible to spell. Was there another book that I mentioned? I can't remember. I don't think so.
Here's flow coming up right now. Let me enlarge my screen for those of you who want to see this. Okay, there we go. So there's flow.
To the person who asked that question, if I missed a book, could you please resubmit a question and say, hey, there's one more book you mentioned, but I think I got the two that were asked about.
Okay, thanks, Dan. All right, next question from Pablo. Do you have examples of the standard work in your book?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. A lot of these slides were taken straight out of the book, that the electronic document I created for my book. So you'll see all that stuff. Okay. Oh, and if I just want to go back for a second to Robert's question about one other book I mentioned is called Personal Kanban, and that's by Jim Benson. And you probably don't need me to spell that. Oh, and you can see Sheena Yeager.
Yeah, I'm bringing up Sheena's, and then let me go back. I'm sorry, what was the name of the book?
Personal Kanban. Interestingly, but the Sheena Yeager is actually blind. So when you see her video, you're thinking, why is her eyes closed? And in fact, she's blind, but she wrote this just fabulous book on choosing.
Okay, so there's Personal Kanban, Jim Benson. Wasn't that the name of the guy that did the Muppets?
That was Jim Henson.
Oh, Henson. You're right, Henson. All right, so there's Personal Kanban for everyone, and I'm going to switch quickly over to Sheena for a second. Let me enlarge this. So it looks like there's some YouTube-related videos for her as well that might be worth looking at. Has she ever presented at TED? Do you know?
I don't think so. However, she has been written up in the New Yorker, and she's been some of her work and the ramifications have appeared in the New York Times as well.
Okay, here's Checklist Manifesto. Someone just asked about that. I have this book and I've read it twice now. It is fantastic. Highly recommend it. Oh yes, so Ram says she has spoken at TED. So if you haven't listened to TED Talks, TED, capital T, capital E, capital D, it sounds like Sheena has spoken there, and I would bet that it's a very compelling talk. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you for pointing that out, yeah.
Okay, Ashok says, I would like to suggest that the standard work is typically considered as a boundary line which can never be changed. To which I respond that you can put critical tasks as you start the journey of improvement, and once it becomes a habit of change it to the next pertinent things. Do you agree?
I'm not sure if I understand the question 100% or your statement. What I will say is, and I think this is what you're getting at, is that standard work is not something that is ever written in stone. These are not the 10 Commandments. It is the 10 Commandments for today. It is the 10 Commandments for, it is the way we do things until we figure out a better way of doing it. And inevitably, we will find something better, or we'll need to make a change because circumstances change all the time. The people in the company change, and they have different capabilities. The product changes, the marketplace changes, the financial situation changes, the physical layout of where people sit changes. Whenever these changes occur, it tends to cause a ripple effect and create more friction within whatever the system is. Not always, but often. So I agree with your point that we set standard work and then we don't just walk away and say, well, that's it, we're done here. We continually revisit it to see whether how we can improve it going forward.
It's just like those repeated PDCA or PDSA cycles, right?
Exactly. Thank you for bringing it to that.
It's a continuous improvement for a reason. One last question is actually, this is a great question. I like this, Tony. One thing I have learned over time is the value of touching things once at work and only once, and at home. I put beer caps, for example, right in the trash. Do you do this sort of thing also?
Well, if you ask my wife, the answer is absolutely yes. If she puts her fork down, I pretty much have her plate cleaned and taken away. If she leaves her socks on the floor, they're in the laundry before she even knows. So yeah, I think once you get into this habit, it certainly spreads everywhere. The one thing I would say about the touching things once is that doesn't necessarily hold true for information, of course, because let's just take a common scenario. Someone sends you an email with a big fat pile of work in it, like you have to review something. Karen, for example, when she was writing her new book, asked me to review a chapter. Well, when I received the email, I didn't have the hour to read the chapter. So I had to at least touch it twice. But what I did was, I said, well, I can't do it now. But what I will do is schedule time for this next Thursday at 2 o'clock.
That's great. Thank you.
Again, when I needed it.
All right, I think that is it. We're out of time right now. I just wanted to also remind you all that if you haven't seen the next 4 webinars coming up, they're going to be the 4 main sections coming in my book that's going to be out. Actually, it's June 8th now is the book launch date, but it is available for pre-order, called The Outstanding Organization. I want to thank Dan Markovitz so much for a great session. This was very valuable, and great stories and suggestions that we can all incorporate. And then also, please, when you are logging off, if you'll log off to use File and then Exit, not just exit out of your browser, that will give you a quick 3-question survey. We'd really love to get your input in as many details as possible about today's webinar, because we are both advocates and a bit fanatic, I'd say, about PDSA, and so we want to always continue to improve the webinars. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
At the risk of sounding like a shill, I have read Karen's book. It's outstanding. Totally worth reading when it comes out.
Thank you, Dan. And I have Dan's here as well. I have dog-eared probably 20 pages in the book, and I highly recommend it as well. It's fantastic. A Factory of One, Dan Markovitz. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.